People always say that death is final, that once the rope tightens, once the body stops moving, once the crowd goes silent, it's over. But in the winter of 1650, in Oxford, England, death made a mistake, and the girl who should have been buried woke up. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't folklore. This is real. Her name was Anne Greene, and what happened to her was so disturbing, so unnatural, that even the people who witnessed it couldn't agree on one thing. Was it a miracle, or was it something far darker? Oxford in the 17th century wasn't the warm, scholarly city you might imagine today. Back then, it was a place of stone streets, flickering lanterns and shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Winter made everything worse. The air smelled like smoke, damp wood, and sickness. People didn't live long. Death wasn't rare. It was normal. And for poor girls like Anne Greene, life was even harder. Anne was in her early 20s, working as a servant in the household of Sir Thomas Reed. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't protected. She was invisible. The kind of person society only noticed when something went wrong. And something did go wrong. Something that would lead her straight to the gallows. Anne became pregnant. In those days, that alone could destroy a woman's life. Unmarried pregnancy wasn't just shameful. It was dangerous. People didn't ask questions like, was she forced? Was she abandoned? Was she desperate? They only saw sin. Anne claimed she gave birth prematurely, that the baby was stillborn. But when the tiny body was discovered, the authorities didn't believe her. They accused her of infanticide. And in 1650, that accusation was basically a death sentence. Anne was arrested, dragged through cold streets, thrown into a prison cell, and left to wait. Prison back then wasn't like modern jail. There were no clean beds, no warm blankets, just darkness, rats, and the sound of other prisoners coughing through the night. Anne sat alone, knowing what was coming. She was sentenced to hang. Not months later, not weeks, soon. And as the execution day approached, Anne did something strange. She prayed, not just for mercy, but for something else. Some witnesses later claimed she said, "I am innocent, and God will prove it." At the time, no one cared. Condemned girls said things like that all the time. But Anne's words would become terrifyingly important. December 14th, 1650. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes the world feel empty. Anne was brought out before a crowd. Executions were public entertainment. People brought their children. They laughed. They pointed. Anne was forced up the wooden steps, her hands tied, her breath shaking. The rope was placed around her neck. And then, something even crueler happened. Her friends, people who felt sorry for her, began pulling on her legs. Not to save her, to make her die faster. It was called helping. They thought it was mercy, but imagine it, your last moments alive, and the people you know are yanking your body downward, forcing the rope deeper into your throat. Anne struggled. Her feet kicked. Her face turned dark. Her eyes bulged. And then, she stopped moving. The crowd watched, silent now, waiting. Minutes passed. Her body hung limp. Finally, the executioner declared her dead. Here's where the story becomes something else. Anne's corpse wasn't sent to a grave. Instead, it was given to a group of medical students and doctors at Oxford. Back then, executed criminals were often used for anatomy lessons. To be cut open, studied, dissected. Anne's body was loaded into a coffin, cold, still, dead, and carried away. No one expected her to ever open her eyes again. But death hadn't finished with Anne Greene. Not yet. When the doctors received her body, they noticed something. Her lips weren't completely blue. Her skin wasn't as cold as it should have been. One of them placed a hand near her mouth and thought, just for a second, he felt warmth. Another leaned closer and swore he saw the faintest movement in her chest. A student laughed nervously. That's impossible. But then, Anne made a sound, a tiny, broken gasp, like someone drowning. The room froze. A corpse, breathing. Panic erupted. Some thought it was the devil. Some thought it was witchcraft. But the doctors, they didn't run. They didn't scream. They did what they knew. They tried to revive her. They forced warm liquids into her mouth. They rubbed her limbs. They placed her near a fire. And slowly, Anne Greene began to return. Her eyes fluttered. Her fingers twitched. And then she opened her mouth, not to scream, not to cry, but to whisper something so faint they barely heard it. I am here. A girl who had been legally executed was waking up, if Anne survived. What exactly did she experience in those minutes of hanging? Was she unconscious? Or was she aware, trapped inside her body, as the world decided she was dead? And even worse, why did she come back? Because what happened next wasn't just survival. It was something that terrified Oxford. For years, when Anne Greene opened her eyes, no one spoke. The room was filled with doctors, students, and the stench of death. They had been preparing to cut her open, to treat her body like an object. But now, the body was breathing, alive, and staring back at them. Some of the students stumbled backward. One of them crossed himself and whispered, "God save us, because what else do you call it? When the dead refuse to stay dead?" Anne couldn't sit up. Her neck was swollen, bruised purple and black where the rope had crushed her throat. Her lips were cracked. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. But she was alive, and the doctors didn't understand how. One of them, Dr. William Petty, leaned in close. He spoke softly, as if afraid she might vanish again. "Anne, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved, slow, weak, but aware. And then she nodded. The room erupted in chaos. A student whispered, "She was hanging for nearly half an hour," another said. "No one survives that." But she had. Somehow, medical science in 1650 was primitive. They didn't have oxygen tanks. They didn't have defibrillators. They had desperation. They poured hot cordial wine into her mouth. They rubbed her arms until the skin turned raw. They placed her near the fire. Someone even suggested bloodletting, thinking it would balance her humors. Anne moaned softly as her body trembled. And then she spoke again, a broken whisper. "Where am I?" One of the doctors answered, "You're in Oxford. You survived." Anne's eyes widened, not with relief, with horror, because she remembered. She remembered the rope, the crowd, the crushing pressure, the moment everything went black. And yet, here she was. Here she was, still here. In a city like Oxford, news traveled faster than truth. By the next morning, everyone knew. The hanged girl was alive. Some called it a miracle. Some called it witchcraft. And some were terrified. Because in the minds of the people back then, there were only a few explanations. God had intervened. The devil had interfered. Or Anne Greene was never meant to die. Crowds gathered outside the house where she was being kept. People whispered prayers. Others threw insults. One man shouted, "She's a demon wearing a girl's skin." Anne could hear them through the walls. Imagine surviving execution, only to be treated like something unnatural. Like you don't belong among the living anymore. Oxford officials were furious. An execution was supposed to be final. The law had spoken. Anne was dead. Legally. So what now? Did they hang her again? Could they? The church became involved. Priests visited her bedside. They questioned her for hours. "Do you repent? Do you confess? Did you make a pact?" Anne, weak and trembling, insisted, "I did nothing. I am innocent." But the priests exchanged nervous glances, because innocence didn't matter as much as the terrifying implication. If God had saved her, then the court had condemned the wrong person, and that was a dangerous thing for society to admit. Anne's body healed slowly, but people noticed something strange. She wasn't the same girl. At night, she would wake up screaming. Not normal screams, the kind of screams that sounded like someone was choking again. Her caretakers said she clawed at her throat in her sleep, as if she could still feel the rope. Sometimes she would stare into the fire for hours, silent, unblinking. And when someone asked what she was thinking, Anne whispered, "I heard something." "What did you hear?" Anne swallowed painfully. The silence. She paused. And then, a voice. The caretaker froze. "A voice?" Anne nodded. Softly. "Calling me back." People began to ask, "What happens when you almost die but don't?" Where did Anne go? In those minutes her body was hanging. Some believed she saw heaven. Others believed she saw hell. But Anne never described light, never described angels. Only cold, only darkness. And that voice. The voice that wouldn't leave her mind. The physicians realized something important. If Anne survived hanging, then she was no longer a criminal in the eyes of many. In fact, people began to believe she had been spared by God. A living proof. A walking miracle. And miracles brought attention. Visitors arrived from surrounding towns. Scholars came to study her. Not just her body, but her soul. Anne became an object again. Not for dissection, but for obsession. And Anne started to feel it. That strange pressure, like something unseen was watching her. Waiting. One evening, as Anne lay half asleep, she heard footsteps. Soft. Slow. Not the caretaker. Not the doctors. These footsteps were wrong. She opened her eyes. The candle in the corner flickered, and in that dim light, she saw a figure standing near her bed. A man, or something shaped like one. Anne tried to speak. Her throat burned. The figure leaned closer, and she smelled it. Earth. Rot. Like the inside of a grave. She froze. Then the figure whispered, in a voice so low it felt inside her skull, "You were not meant to return." Anne's eyes filled with tears. The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and Anne screamed. When the caretakers rushed in, Anne was shaking violently, her bruised neck bleeding where she had clawed at it. They demanded to know what happened. Anne could barely speak, but she managed one sentence. "It came back." What came back? Anne's eyes were wide, not with fear of death, but fear of what follows death. The thing that was waiting. After that night, whispers changed. People stopped saying God saved her. They started saying, she brought something with her, because what kind of person survives the gallows, and then starts seeing shadows in the dark? What kind of person comes back, and isn't alone? By the time Anne Greene could stand again, Oxford had already turned her into a legend. Not because she was brave, not because she was innocent, but because she was impossible. A girl who had been executed and returned. People didn't know how to treat her. Some knelt when she passed, whispering prayers. Others backed away, clutching their children. Because deep down, everyone was thinking the same thing. If death couldn't keep her, what else couldn't it keep? The court was embarrassed. Anne was supposed to be dead. The sentence had been carried out. The paperwork was finished. But now she was walking, breathing, speaking. So the officials gathered in secret. Some argued, she must be hanged again. The law demands it. Others hesitated. because the crowd outside was already murmuring. If they tried to execute her twice, it would look like they were fighting against God. And in the 1600s, that was dangerous. So after days of debate, Anne Greene was granted something rare. A pardon. Not because they suddenly cared, but because everyone was afraid of what her survival meant. Anne was free. But freedom didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exile from death. Anne returned to the streets, and people stared. They stared the way you stare at something unnatural, like an animal born with two heads, like a corpse that refuses to rot. She could hear the whispers. That's her. The hanged girl. She's cursed. Anne kept her head down, but she could feel it. Oxford didn't see her as Anne anymore. Oxford saw her as a question, a crack in reality, a reminder that the world wasn't as solid as people pretended, and Anne began to wonder. Maybe they were right, because she didn't feel normal. Not inside, but something else stayed frozen. Her neck healed, slowly, but the pain never fully left. Every swallow felt like broken glass. Every breath reminded her of the rope. At night, she still woke up choking. Sometimes she swore she could feel hands pulling her legs down again, forcing her toward death. But worse than the pain was the silence that came after she stopped struggling. Anne told one doctor, "I thought it was over, and then I realized I could still hear." The doctor frowned. "Hear what?" Anne's voice dropped. The crowd. She swallowed. I was hanging, unable to move. And I could hear them talking about me like I was already gone. Her hands trembled. I was still there. The doctor went pale. Because that wasn't a miracle. That was horror. One evening, Anne sat with a priest. He believed she was spared by God. He wanted her to tell her story, to inspire faith. But Anne stared at the floor. Finally, she whispered, "Father, what if it wasn't God?" The priest stiffened. "What do you mean?" Anne's eyes filled with tears. When everything went dark, "I didn't see heaven." The priest's voice was sharp now. "Then what did you see?" Anne hesitated. "Then, nothing, just nothing." A pause. And then, something noticed me. The priest's mouth went dry. Anne continued. It felt like standing at the edge of a door. And something on the other side didn't want me to leave. After Anne's survival, Oxford felt different. People reported odd. A student claimed he saw Anne walking at night, even though she was supposedly asleep. A woman swore she heard Anne's voice outside her window, whispering prayers in the dark. Another man said, "She passed me in the street, and her shadow didn't match her steps." Rumors spread. Fear spread faster. Because Anne wasn't just a survivor. She was a reminder. A reminder that the line between life and death was thin, and maybe torn. She couldn't stay. Every face reminded her. Every street corner felt haunted. So she made a decision. She would leave, start over, somewhere no one knew her name. The doctors even helped her. They gave her money, clothes, a chance, not out of kindness, but because even they were uneasy keeping her close. Anne packed quietly, and on the night before she left, she slept, for the first time in weeks, without fear. Or so she thought. Anne woke to the sound of breathing. Not her own, someone else's. Slow, wet, close. Her eyes snapped open. The candle beside her bed was out. The room was pitch black, but she could feel it. A presence. Standing there, watching. Anne tried to speak. Nothing came out. Then, that voice returned. The same voice she had heard before. Low, gravel-like. "You cannot run." Anne's body went cold. She whispered, "Who are you?" A pause. Then, the one who waited. Anne's breath hitched. The voice leaned closer. "You were mine." Anne's throat burned. "No." The voice softened, almost amused. "The rope stopped you. But I did not." Anne squeezed her eyes shut. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Then she felt it, a hand, Not warm, not human, touching her neck, right where the rope had been. Anne screamed. The candle flared to life suddenly, and the room was empty. Nothing there. No one. Only Anne, shaking violently. When her caretaker found her, Anne was pale as death. But the caretaker froze for another reason. Around Anne's throat, fresh bruises had appeared. Dark, finger-shaped, as if someone had grabbed her in the night. Anne stared into the mirror and whispered. It followed me back. Oxford thought Anne had survived execution, that she was spared, that she was lucky. But Anne knew something else now. She wasn't spared. She was returned, and whatever existed in that darkness, whatever had noticed her, had not forgotten. Because some doors, once opened, do not close again. Anne Greene left Oxford quietly. No parade, no celebration, no happy ending, just a young woman walking away from the city that had tried to kill her, with bruises still visible on her neck. The cold air burned her lungs as she stepped into the countryside. And for the first time since the gallows, there were no crowds watching her, no whispers, no ropes, just silence. But silence doesn't erase what happened. Because how do you go back to a normal life after you've felt yourself die? Oxford called it a miracle. The doctors called it a medical wonder. The church called it God's mercy. But Anne knew the truth was uglier. It wasn't magic. It wasn't heaven opening up. It was failure. A careless execution. A rope that didn't finish the job. A body that clung to life longer than anyone expected. And that's what made it terrifying. Because it meant something simple. Death isn't always clean. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's uncertain. Sometimes you can be halfway gone and still hear the world moving on without you. Anne told someone later, I remember the voices. That detail haunted the doctors most. Not the bruises, not the gasping breath. The fact that she might have been aware, while everyone decided she was already dead. Even after she left, Anne Greene didn't disappear. Her story spread across England. Pamphlets were printed. A wonder of wonders, news from the dead. People bought them like horror stories. Like entertainment. Like Anne's suffering was something to read by candlelight. Scholars argued over her case. Doctors wrote about it for years. They studied her survival as one of the earliest recorded examples of resuscitation. Anne became famous, but not as a person, as an event, as a question, as proof that the line between life and death could blur. Here's the part that feels unreal. Anne was officially pardoned. She was not executed again. In the eyes of many, her survival was taken as a sign she was innocent. And history records that she eventually married, had children, and lived for years afterward. A woman who had been pronounced dead went on to live a life. But imagine what that life felt like. Imagine carrying that moment forever. The rope, the pressure, the darkness, the coffin, the breath returning. How do you laugh normally after that? How do you sleep peacefully? How do you ever stop feeling the phantom burn of hemp around your throat? The horror isn't that she came back with something supernatural. The horror is that she came back at all. Because Anne Greene proved something that unsettles people even now. Execution isn't always instant. Death isn't always certain. And sometimes, the world can declare you gone. While you're still there, still trapped, still breathing, still waiting for someone to notice. Anne Greene was lucky. But luck is a strange word for someone who survived. Only because death hesitated. Some stories end with a funeral. Anne Greene's story ended with a wedding. But that doesn't make it less disturbing. Because somewhere in Oxford, on a cold December morning, a girl stopped moving on the rope. And the world believed it was over. They put her in a coffin. They carried her away. And then, she opened her eyes. and for the rest of her life, she was living proof that the dead don't always stay dead.